Miss Marple and the Widow Who Mustn't Tell the Truth. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Chapter 1. Smoke at Vespers. The November evening had settled over St. Mary Mead like a damp gray shroud, the kind of raw, misty twilight that seemed to seep through one's very bones. Miss Jane Marple drew her woolen shawl more closely about her shoulders as she made her way back from evening service at the parish church, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the wet cobblestones. The service had been particularly well attended for a Thursday evening, she reflected. Canon Clement had delivered a thoughtful sermon on the virtue of honesty, though she wondered if young Mrs. Peterson in the third pew had been paying attention, given the way she'd been fidgeting with her gloves throughout. As Miss Marple turned into the lane that led to her cottage, she caught sight of Constable Sanders approaching from the opposite direction. The young policeman's face wore an expression of mild concern as he paused outside the neat cottage that stood directly across from the vicarage. "Evening? Miss Marple," he called out, touching his helmet respectfully. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Rowe's place this evening?" Miss Marple followed his gaze to the modest dwelling where Mrs. Elath Rowe had lived quietly since the war. The cottage was one of the prettier ones in the village, with its climbing ivy and well-tended front garden, though it had an air of genteel poverty about it that spoke of a widow making do on a small pension. "Unusual in what way, Constable?" Miss Marple inquired, though even as she spoke she could see what had caught the young man's attention. A peculiar bluish smoke was seeping from around the edges of the front window, staining the white lace curtains with an odd discoloration. It was the wrong sort of smoke entirely for a cozy evening fire, and far too much of it. "That smoke's been getting thicker these past few minutes," Sanders said, quickening his pace toward the cottage. "Looks like something's gone wrong with the chimney." Miss Marple hurried after him, her sharp eyes taking in details as they approached. The cottage's front door was painted a cheerful yellow, though the paint was beginning to peel slightly around the brass knocker. The small front garden showed the careful attention of someone who took pride in appearances despite limited means. Constable Sanders rapped firmly on the door. "Mrs. Rowe! Mrs. Rowe! Are you quite all right in there?" No answer came from within, though they could both hear an odd sort of wheezing, crackling sound that suggested a fire struggling against some obstruction. "The door's not locked," Sanders observed, trying the handle. They stepped into a narrow hallway that led directly to a small parlor at the front of the house. The room was thick with acrid, blue-tinged smoke that made their eyes water immediately. Through the haze, Miss Marple could make out the figure of a man slumped in the wing-back chair beside the hearth. "Good heavens," she murmured, pressing her handkerchief to her nose. Constable Sanders moved quickly to the window, struggling with the latch to let in fresh air. The man in the chair was motionless, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. Miss Marple recognized him immediately, despite the poor visibility. Mr. Jonah Black, the parish rent collector, a thin, sharp-featured man in his 50s, who had the unfortunate reputation of being rather too interested in other people's business. "Is he?" Sanders began. "I'm afraid so, Constable," Miss Marple replied quietly. She had seen death before, and there was something unmistakably final about the way Mr. Black sat in that chair. The smoke was beginning to clear now that the window was open, and they could see the source of the trouble. The fireplace was behaving most peculiarly, with smoke and soot billowing back into the room instead of drawing properly up the chimney. The damper appeared to be partially closed, though not entirely shut. "Foolish thing to do, shutting the flue like that with a fire burning," Sanders muttered, moving closer to examine the hearth. "Though I suppose if you're not used to managing fires—" Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes were already cataloging the scene before them. Something struck her as not quite right, though she couldn't immediately put her finger on what it was. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes of being summoned, his medical bag in hand and his usually cheerful demeanor sobered by the circumstances. He made his examination with professional thoroughness, while Miss Marple and Constable Sanders waited in the narrow hallway. "Death by smoke inhalation," he pronounced grimly, emerging from the parlor with soot-stained hands. "There's a shallow graze on his temple, probably from when he fell or stumbled trying to get away from the smoke. Poor fellow wouldn't have lasted long in that atmosphere." "Where is Mrs. Rowe?" Miss Marple inquired gently, as if summoned by her words. They heard the front gate creak open. Mrs. Elath Rowe appeared in the doorway, a small, neat woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and the sort of pale, anxious expression that seemed permanently etched on her features. She carried a wicker basket that suggested she'd been out on some domestic errand. "Oh, my goodness," she exclaimed, taking in the scene before her with wide, startled eyes. "What's happened? Why are you all here?" Her gaze fell on the open parlor door and the lingering traces of smoke, and her face went white as chalk. "Mrs. Rowe," Constable Sanders said as gently as his official manner would allow, "I'm afraid there's been an accident. Mr. Black appears to have been overcome by smoke from your fire." "Mr. Black?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "But he came for tea." And then suddenly she swayed on her feet, and Miss Marple moved quickly to support her elbow. "My dear, you've had a terrible shock," Miss Marple said kindly. "Perhaps we should sit down, and you can tell us exactly what happened." But even as she spoke these comforting words, Miss Marple's mind was working with its characteristic precision. Something about Mrs. Rowe's reaction troubled her, though the poor woman was clearly genuinely distressed. As Dr. Haydock and Constable Sanders continued their official duties, Miss Marple found herself drawn back outside. The evening air felt clean and sharp after the close atmosphere of the cottage, and she stood for a moment in the small front garden, collecting her thoughts. It was then that her observant eyes caught something that made her pause. There, on one of the ivy leaves that climbed the cottage wall, just beneath the chimney, was a light dusting of what appeared to be flour. How very curious! And there, on the stone step, the tiniest sparkle of what might have been salt caught the lamplight. Miss Marple bent closer, her knitting bag dangling from her arm as she examined the scene with the intensity of a scholar studying an ancient manuscript. Along the guttering, she could make out a faint greasy smear, and nestled against the downspout was something even more intriguing. A small grayish pellet about the size of a pea, soft and doughy to the touch. She straightened up slowly, filing these curious details away in her orderly mind. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that the smallest inconsistencies often prove to be the most significant. Flour where only ivy should grow, salt on a doorstep, and a mysterious pellet of dough were not the sort of things one typically found after a simple accident with a poorly managed fire. No, Miss Marple thought to herself as she made her way home through the gathering darkness. There was definitely more to this tragic evening than met the eye. Chapter 2. The Widow's Story. Inspector. Slack arrived at Mrs. Rowe's cottage the following morning with his characteristic air of brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple noted with some amusement that he seemed rather more subdued than usual. Perhaps the inspector was finally learning that village matters were seldom as straightforward as they first appeared. Mrs. Rowe had spent the night with her neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, and returned to her cottage looking pale and drawn. She wore the same dark blue dress she had worn the previous evening, though Miss Marple observed that she had taken more care with her appearance this morning. Her hair was neatly pinned, and she had applied a light dusting of powder that somehow made her look younger and more vulnerable. "Now then, Mrs. Rowe," Inspector Slack began, settling himself in the very chair where poor Mr. Black had met his end, seemingly oblivious to any sense of impropriety. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened yesterday evening. Take your time." Mrs. Rowe twisted her hands in her lap, her wedding ring catching the morning light. Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain as a calming influence, sat quietly in the corner with her knitting, though her attention was entirely focused on the widow's account. "Mr. Black came to see me about the rent," Mrs. Rowe began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He often collected on Thursday evenings, you see. I invited him in for tea, as I always did. He was quite particular about his tea, liked it strong with 2 lumps of sugar." Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "What time did he arrive?" "Just after 5:30. I remember because I'd been listening to the wireless and the news was finishing." Her voice wavered slightly. "We sat here in the parlor and I served tea. Everything seemed quite normal at first." "At first?" Slack prompted. Mrs. Rowe's hands fluttered nervously. "Well, after a few minutes, Mr. Black began to complain about the fire smoking. He said, 'Perhaps I ought to adjust the damper.' I told him I wasn't very good with such things. Since Harold died, I've never quite managed fires properly." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked, but her eyes never left Mrs. Rowe's face. There was something in the woman's manner that suggested she was choosing her words very carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. Then what happened? Mr. Black got up to fiddle with the damper himself. He was always quite handy with mechanical things, but the smoke seemed to get worse rather than better. He started coughing terribly and then... She pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. "I'm afraid I panicked. I ran to the kitchen to fetch some water, thinking perhaps if I dampened the fire, but when I came back, he had collapsed in the chair." Inspector Slack frowned at his notes. "You went to the kitchen for water?" "Yes, I thought." "Mrs. Rowe," Slack interrupted, his tone becoming sharper, "I've examined your kitchen this morning. The teapot on the counter is bone dry. There's yesterday's cup and saucer sitting on a tray, unwashed. If you served tea to Mr. Black yesterday evening, where are the tea things?" The color drained from Mrs. Rowe's already pale face. I must have washed them up later after all the commotion. I wasn't thinking clearly." Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Rowe's left hand had moved unconsciously to cover her right, where a pale band of skin around her ring finger told its own story. The wedding ring she wore had not been worn regularly for some time, or perhaps had been removed recently and hastily replaced. "You said you panicked and ran to the kitchen," Slack pressed on relentlessly. "Yet your kitchen door was found latched from the inside. How do you account for that?" Mrs. Rowe's confusion appeared genuine. "Latched? But that's impossible. I never latched the kitchen door during the day. There must be some mistake." Miss Marple noticed the inspector's growing suspicion and decided to intervene gently. "My dear Mrs. Rowe, you mentioned that you're not good with fires since your husband passed. Have you had trouble with the chimney before?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Rowe replied, seeming grateful for the change of subject. "It's been quite troublesome lately, especially when the wind is from the east. Sometimes the smoke blows back something dreadful." "And yesterday evening, was the wind from the east?" Mrs. Rowe paused thinking. "No, I don't believe so. It was quite still, actually. That's what made it so strange." Inspector Slack had been examining the parlor while they talked, and now he turned back to Mrs. Rowe with a frown. "There's something else that puzzles me. You said Mr. Black arrived just after 5:30, yet the church service didn't begin until 6. Constable Sanders saw you coming from the direction of the church when he discovered the smoke. Mrs. Rowe's face flushed. I wasn't at the service. I had stepped out on an errand. What sort of errand takes you in the direction of the church at that time of evening? I was visiting a friend who lives near the vicarage. The words came out too quickly, and Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Rowe's fingers worried at the edge of her apron. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something else that made her lean forward slightly in her chair. There, folded in Mrs. Rowe's apron pocket, was what appeared to be the corner of a railway ticket. The printing was too small to read from a distance, but the distinctive orange and black coloring was unmistakable. Mrs. Rowe, Miss Marple said gently, forgive me for asking, but you seem to have powder under the brim of your hat. Have you been traveling recently? The question seemed to strike Mrs. Rowe like a physical blow. Her hand flew to her hat, the same black felt she had worn the previous evening, and Miss Marple could indeed see traces of face powder along the inner band, as if it had been hastily put on after being removed. No, I haven't been anywhere. I don't know why you would think that. But her denial carried no conviction, and Inspector Slack was beginning to look distinctly skeptical. Mrs. Rowe, he said firmly, I think you'd better tell us the truth about where you were yesterday evening. And don't say you were visiting a friend near the church, because I intend to check with everyone in that area. Mrs. Rowe looked trapped, her eyes darting between the inspector and Miss Marple like a cornered animal. Miss Marple felt a surge of sympathy for her. Here was a woman carrying some burden of secrecy, perhaps something that seemed shameful to her, but might be entirely innocent. My dear, Miss Marple said quietly, whatever you're afraid to tell us, it couldn't be worse than having Inspector Slack think you've been deliberately misleading him about a man's death. At these words, Mrs. Rowe's composure finally crumbled. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep, not the genteel tears of a lady, but the harsh, broken sobs of someone who had been holding back fear and worry for too long. I can't, she whispered through her tears. You don't understand. If I tell the truth, they'll take everything away. The cottage, the pension, everything Harold died for. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. Here was the crux of the matter, Miss Marple realized. Mrs. Rowe was indeed a widow who couldn't tell the truth, but not necessarily because she was guilty of murder. A widow who mustn't tell the truth, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles pausing in their rhythmic clicking. In her long experience of village life, she had encountered this particular tragedy before, the terrible choice between honesty and survival that faced so many women in Mrs. Rowe's position. Whatever secret the poor woman was guarding, Miss Marple suspected it had more to do with the practicalities of keeping body and soul together than with any criminal intent. But secrets, as Miss Marple well knew, had a way of providing opportunities for those with darker motives. And somewhere in this tangle of deception and desperation, a man had died under very suspicious circumstances indeed. Chapter 3: Flower on the Ivy. After Inspector Slack had concluded his rather unsatisfactory interview with Mrs. Rowe, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the cottage's exterior. The morning light revealed details that had been obscured by the previous evening's mist, and she was determined to examine more carefully those curious observations that had caught her attention. The inspector had departed with a promise to return once he had made inquiries about Mrs. Rowe's supposed friend near the vicarage, leaving behind an atmosphere of barely suppressed suspicion. Poor Mrs. Rowe had retreated to her kitchen, where the sound of vigorous cleaning suggested she was attempting to work off her nervous energy with domestic activity. Miss Marple positioned herself beneath the chimney, her keen eyes scanning the ivy that climbed the cottage wall. The dusting of flowers she'd noticed the previous evening was still there, caught on several leaves in a pattern that seemed oddly deliberate. It was not the sort of random scattering one might expect from a kitchen accident, but rather appeared to have fallen from above. She bent down and carefully lifted the small grayish pellet from where it rested against the guttering. In the daylight, its composition was clearer, definitely some sort of dough, with a slightly greasy texture that left a residue on her fingers. As she crumbled it gently between her thumb and forefinger, something small and hard rolled free, a caraway seed. Miss Marple held the tiny seed up to the light, her brow furrowing in concentration. She knew for a fact that Mrs. Rowe was not given to fancy baking. Indeed, she had often remarked to Miss Marple at the village shop that she kept to the plainest possible fare, finding anything more elaborate beyond both her means and her skills. Yet here was evidence of spiced bread, dropped from somewhere high above the cottage. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her contemplation. Mrs. Rowe emerged, looking somewhat composed after her bout of cleaning, though her eyes were still red-rimmed from weeping. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "I hope you don't think too badly of me. I know I haven't been entirely straightforward with the inspector." "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, slipping the crumbled dough into her handkerchief, "we all have our reasons for the things we do. But you must understand that in a matter as serious as this, the truth has a way of emerging, whether we will it or not." Mrs. Rowe nodded miserably. "I suppose you're right. It's just that some truths are more dangerous than others, aren't they?" Miss Marple gave her a penetrating look. "Indeed they are. But often the danger lies not in the truth itself, but in allowing others to twist it to their own purposes." She excused herself and made her way into the cottage, ostensibly to retrieve her gloves, which she claimed to have left behind. In truth, she was eager to examine the parlor more thoroughly in the clear light of day. The room bore the lingering odor of smoke and soot, though Mrs. Rowe had obviously done her best to air it out. Miss Marple moved directly to the fireplace, where the damper lever protruded from the side of the chimney breast. She was particularly interested in this mechanism, having paid close attention to Inspector Slack's dismissive assumption about Mrs. Rowe's competence with such things. The lever itself was made of iron, blackened with age and use, but as Miss Marple examined it more closely, she noticed something peculiar. While most of its surface bore the expected patina of soot and rust, there was a distinct area near the handle that appeared to have been recently disturbed. More significantly, this area had a faint greasy film that was quite different from the usual accumulation of hearth grime. It looked very much like tallow, the sort of grease one might find on hands that had been handling raw meat or working with cooking fat. Her attention turned next to the mantelpiece itself. This was a simple wooden shelf painted white, but showing the wear and small damages that accumulated in any well-used home. Along the edge closest to the chimney, Miss Marple discovered something that made her pause, a shallow groove or scratch mark forming a gentle arc across the paint. It was the sort of mark that might be made by a rope or strap being drawn tightly across the wood, and then lifted away. Miss Marple stood back and considered these observations with the methodical approach that had served her so well in previous mysteries. The pattern of flour on the ivy, the greasy pellet of spiced dough, the tallow residue on the damper lever, and now this arc-shaped scratch on the mantel. Each detail by itself might be explained away as coincidence or accident. Together, however, they suggested something far more deliberate. She was interrupted in her contemplation by the return of Inspector Slack, whose expression indicated that his inquiries had not proceeded as he had hoped. "Confounded woman," he muttered as he entered the parlor. "I've spoken to every household within half a mile of the vicarage, and not one of them received a visit from Mrs. Rowe yesterday evening. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't visiting friends." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected as much, Inspector, though I rather think her deception stems from necessity rather than guilt." "Necessity?" Slack's tone was skeptical. What sort of necessity requires lying to the police about a man's death? The sort that threatens a woman's very survival, Miss Marple replied quietly. Consider her situation, Inspector. A war widow living alone on a modest pension, occupying a cottage that likely comes to her by virtue of her status. What sort of truth might endanger all of that? Before Slack could respond, Miss Marple continued, but that is a matter for later investigation. At the moment, I'm more concerned with understanding exactly how Mr. Black came to die in this room. She gestured toward the fireplace. You mentioned yesterday that it appeared he had foolishly shut the flue while a fire was burning. But examine the damper lever more carefully. Inspector, do you notice anything unusual about its surface? Slack moved closer, squinting at the ironwork. It's a bit greasy, I suppose, but that's not uncommon near a hearth. Quite right. But this particular grease has the consistency of tallow, not the usual accumulation of cooking vapors. And see here? She pointed to the mantel edge. This scratch mark suggests that something was secured across this space and then removed. What sort of something? The inspector asked. I'm not entirely certain yet, Miss Marple admitted. But I suspect that if one wished to block a chimney from above, say, to cause smoke to backdraft into a room, one might devise some sort of temporary obstruction that could be held in place and then removed, leaving only traces behind. She showed him the crumbled dough in her handkerchief. This fell from the guttering, Inspector. It contains a caraway seed, which suggests it came from spiced bread. Yet Mrs. Rao bakes only the plainest loaves, if she bakes at all. Slack examined the evidence with growing interest. You're suggesting this chimney was deliberately blocked? I'm suggesting that the physical evidence points to something far more sophisticated than a simple accident with a poorly managed fire, Miss Marple replied. Someone with considerable knowledge of chimneys and baking created this situation. The question is, who and why they chose to stage it in Mrs. Rowe's parlor? The inspector was quiet for several moments, processing these revelations. Finally, he looked up at Miss Marple with grudging respect. If you're right, then we're dealing with murder made to look like an accident. But who would go to such elaborate lengths to kill Jonah Black? Miss Marple folded her handkerchief carefully around the evidence. In my experience, Inspector, the most elaborate crimes are often committed by those who wish not only to eliminate their victim, but to ensure that suspicion falls elsewhere. Someone wanted Mr. Black dead, but they also wanted poor Mrs. Rowe to bear the blame. As they left the cottage together, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the ivy-covered wall and the chimney above. Somewhere in this puzzle of flour and dough, grease and scratches, lay the key to understanding not only how Jonah Black had died, but why his killer had chosen this particular method and this particular location for their crime. Chapter 4. The Chimney That Blocked Itself. Inspector Slack's initial response to Miss Marple's theory was, as she had expected, one of professional skepticism mixed with a certain impatience that seemed to be his natural state when confronted with village complexities. Really, Miss Marple? He said as they walked back toward the village center. You're suggesting someone climbed onto Mrs. Rowe's roof to deliberately block her chimney? It seems rather far-fetched. People do shut flues accidentally. Happens all the time. Fellow gets distracted, gives the damper a twist the wrong way. Doesn't realize what he's done until the smoke starts backing up. Miss Marple paused beside the village green, where the ancient oak tree cast dappled shadows across the grass. She had learned over the years that Inspector Slack's initial resistance to unconventional theories was as predictable as the Morning Post, and usually just as temporary. Of course, people shut flues, Inspector, she agreed mildly. But consider the sequence of events. Mr. Black was an experienced man about the house. You heard Mrs. Rowe say he was handy with mechanical things. Would such a man have made such a fundamental error? Perhaps he was distracted. Perhaps his mind was on other matters. But that raises another interesting point, Miss Marple said, settling herself on one of the wooden benches that faced the green. What might have been occupying Mr. Black's thoughts so completely that he would make such a fatal mistake? From what I understand, he was a man of rather rigid habits, quite methodical in his approach to life. Slack grudgingly joined her on the bench, though his posture suggested he was merely humoring an elderly woman's fancies. "Assuming for the moment that you're right about this being deliberate," he said, "how exactly would someone go about blocking a chimney from above?" Miss Marple smiled slightly, recognizing the shift in his tone that indicated genuine curiosity beneath the official skepticism. "Well," she began, "if one wished to create a temporary obstruction that would later disappear, leaving minimal evidence, one might use something organic, something that would eventually give way under heat and moisture." She paused to watch young Timothy Fletcher chase his terrier across the green, the dog having apparently liberated someone's hat and converted it into an impromptu toy. "Raw dough, for instance," she continued, "properly prepared and positioned, could serve as a quite effective temporary seal, particularly if one added salt to help it bind, and a bit of grease to make it adhere properly to the stonework." Inspector Slack frowned. "But how would you get it into position? The chimney throat is several feet down from the top of the stack." "Exactly the right question, Inspector. One would need some way to lower the obstruction into place and hold it there until the heat from below caused it to set firmly enough to maintain the seal." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she spoke. "A strap or rope, perhaps, dropped down through the chimney and pulled taut across the mantelpiece edge to provide the necessary tension." "That would explain your scratch mark on the mantel," Slack admitted reluctantly. "Precisely. The strap would hold the dough plug in position just long enough for the rising heat to firm it up. Once it was secure, the strap could be withdrawn, leaving the room looking entirely normal. The damper would appear to be in its usual position. The fire would seem to be burning naturally, and poor Mr. Black would have no reason to suspect anything was amiss until it was too late." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the peaceful village life unfold around them. Mrs. Jameson emerged from the post office with her daily gossip and her correspondence, nodding pleasantly to them before hurrying off to share whatever news she'd gleaned. Young Dr. Peaton cycled past on his rounds, his medical bag balanced precariously in his bicycle basket. "There's still the matter of access," Inspector Slack said eventually. "Someone would have had to get onto the roof without being seen, and in broad daylight, too, if they were setting this up before Mr. Black's visit." "Not necessarily broad daylight," Miss Marple observed. "Remember, this was a November evening, and the mist was quite thick. Visibility was poor, and most people were indoors, preparing their evening meals or attending to domestic matters. Someone moving quietly along the rooftops might easily go unnoticed." She paused in her knitting to consider a dropped stitch. "Besides, Inspector, whoever did this had intimate knowledge, not only of Mrs. Rowe's cottage, but also of Mr. Black's habits. They knew he would be visiting yesterday evening, and they knew he would be alone with Mrs. Rowe. That suggests someone from the village itself, someone who wouldn't appear out of place even if they were spotted moving about." Inspector Slack pulled out his notebook and began making entries. "Assuming you're right about the method, we'd be looking for someone with access to dough, someone familiar with the cottage layout, and someone who knew about Black's appointment with Mrs. Rowe. And someone with a compelling reason to want Mr. Black dead, but not want to be connected to his death directly," Miss Marple added. "Don't forget, Inspector, this method was chosen not just to kill, but to cast suspicion on Mrs. Rowe. Our murderer wanted her to be blamed for what happened. Why would anyone want to frame Mrs. Rowe specifically? She seems harmless enough, apart from her mysterious reluctance to tell the truth about her whereabouts yesterday." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. That's an excellent question, and I suspect the answer lies in understanding what Mrs. Rowe is so desperately trying to hide. Sometimes, Inspector, people become vulnerable to manipulation precisely because they have secrets they cannot afford to reveal. A new possibility had begun to form in Miss Marple's mind as she spoke. What if Mrs. Rowe's secret, whatever it was, had somehow become known to our murderer? What if the choice of her cottage as the scene of the crime was not random, but calculated to ensure that she would be unable to provide a convincing alibi? There's another aspect to consider, she continued. The killer used spice dough containing caraway seed. That's quite specific, Inspector. Not everyone bakes with caraway, and fewer still would think to use it in this particular way. You're suggesting someone with professional baking experience? I'm suggesting someone sufficiently familiar with dough and its properties to know exactly how it would behave under these circumstances, Miss Marple replied. Someone who understood that the right mixture would hold long enough to create a deadly atmosphere in the room, then give way and fall, leaving only crumbs and traces behind. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Right then. First thing is to check with everyone in the village who might have had access to caraway seeds yesterday. The baker, obviously, but also anyone who might have been doing their own baking. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. An excellent starting point, though I suspect, Inspector, that when we identify our baker, we'll also discover someone with very particular reasons for wanting both Mr. Black dead and Mrs. Rowe disgraced. As they rose from the bench and prepared to continue their investigation, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar satisfaction that came from seeing a complex puzzle begin to reveal its underlying logic. The chimney had not blocked itself. Of that she was now certain. Someone with considerable skill and malicious intent had arranged Mr. Black's death with the cold precision of a well-planned recipe. The question that remained was identifying the cook. Chapter 5. A Seed in the Dough. The afternoon sun had broken. Through the November clouds as Miss Marple and Inspector Slack made their way down Bakehouse Lane, the narrow cobbled street that led to the heart of St. Mary Mead's commercial district. The familiar mingling of scents, yeast and flour, cold smoke from the chimneys, and the faint sweetness of Mrs. Pollock's flower shop created an atmosphere of reassuring normality that seemed almost incongruous. Given their grim purpose, Miss Marple had insisted they approach their investigation methodically, beginning with the most obvious source of the caraway seed that had proven so significant. Cobb's Bakehouse stood at the corner where Bakehouse Lane met the High Street, its bow-fronted windows displaying the day's offerings with the pride of 3 generations of village bakers. As they approached the shop, Miss Marple noticed that the familiar aroma of fresh bread was particularly pronounced today, carrying with it the distinctive fragrance of caraway that she'd come to associate with the establishment's specialty loaves. Afternoon, Miss Marple called out Bertie Cobb, the baker's son, as they entered through the shop's jingling doorway. He was a pleasant young man in his 20s, with a florid complexion and strong forearms that seemed to be occupational requirements for his trade. "What can we do for you today?" Miss Marple smiled warmly at him, while her observant eyes took in the details of the shop's interior. The display cases were well stocked despite the lateness of the hour, and she noticed that several loaves of caraway-studded bread remained unsold, unusual for a Thursday, when such specialty items typically disappeared quickly. "Good afternoon, Bertie," she replied. "Inspector Slack and I were hoping to speak with your parents about yesterday's baking. We're investigating poor Mr. Black's unfortunate accident." At the mention of Black's name, Bertie's cheerful expression clouded slightly. "Terrible business that, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. The man was always poking his nose where it didn't belong." Inspector Slack stepped forward with his official manner. "What do you mean by that, young man?" Bertie glanced nervously toward the back of the shop. where the sound of vigorous kneading suggested someone was hard at work. "Oh, nothing specific, Inspector. Just that Mr. Black had a way of making himself unpopular, always asking questions, always implying he knew more than he was saying." Miss Marple fingered the caraway seed she had wrapped in a handkerchief. "Bertie, you had caraway bread yesterday, I see. Do you recall how many loaves your mother baked?" "The usual Thursday batch. 8 loaves, I think. Mother's particular about her caraway bread. Uses only the freshest seeds. Orders them special from London." He seemed proud of this family tradition, though Miss Marple detected an undertone of anxiety in his voice. "And they all sold?" Inspector Slack inquired. "Well, no, not all. We've still got 3 left, as you can see." He gestured to the display. "That's a bit unusual, actually. Normally they go quite quickly." At this moment, Mrs. Bessie Cobb emerged from the bakehouse at the rear of the shop, her plump figure dusted with flour, and her face bearing the satisfied expression of someone who had completed a good day's work. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair pinned severely back and the capable hands of someone who had spent her life shaping dough. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed with genuine pleasure. "How lovely to see you. And Inspector Slack, though I imagine this isn't a social call, given what's happened to poor Mr. Black." Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Cobb's greeting, while warm, carried a certain weariness that hadn't been present in their previous encounters. There was something in the woman's manner that suggested she was prepared for difficult questions. "Indeed not, Mrs. Cobb," Inspector Slack replied. "We're trying to understand the circumstances of Mr. Black's death." "I'm told you're particularly known for your caraway bread." Mrs. Cobb's chest swelled with pride. 3 generations of Cobbs have been baking caraway loaves, Inspector. My grandmother's recipe passed down through the family. We're the only bakery in the village that uses genuine caraway seeds. Most places substitute cheaper alternatives. Miss Marple stepped close to examine the remaining loaves in the display case. The seeds were indeed generous and evenly distributed, each one plump and aromatic. She had purchased bread from Cobb's many times over the years and was familiar with their distinctive quality. "Mrs. Cobb," she said carefully, "you mentioned that these are made from your grandmother's recipe? I don't suppose you've shared that recipe with anyone recently?" The baker's wife shifted uncomfortably, her hand smoothing her apron in a gesture that Miss Marple recognized as a nervous habit. "Share the recipe? Oh no, Miss Marple. That's been a family secret for decades. Why would you ask such a thing?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Inspector Slack produced the handkerchief containing the crumbled dough and caraway seed. "We found this near the scene of Mr. Black's death." "Can you identify what type of bread it might have come from?" Mrs. Cobb examined the evidence with the critical eye of a professional, though Miss Marple observed that her hands trembled slightly as she handled the handkerchief. "Well," she said finally, "it's definitely caraway bread. The seed looks like our quality. It has that particular plumpness and color. But this dough," she frowned, rolling a small portion between her fingers, "it's been mixed with something. There's fat in it that shouldn't be there, and perhaps salt. It's not been baked, just kneaded and shaped. Is there any reason someone might want raw caraway dough?" Slack pressed. Mrs. Cobb's face had grown pale, and she glanced nervously toward the back room where her husband could be heard moving about. "I can't imagine why anyone would want unbaked dough, Inspector. It doesn't keep well, and it's not pleasant to eat raw." Miss Marple had been observing the interaction with her usual attention to detail, and she now noticed something that made her pulse quicken slightly. On Mrs. Cobb's apron, just above the right pocket, was a small stain that looked remarkably like the tallow residue she had found on the damper lever in Mrs. Rowe's cottage. "Mrs. Cobb," she said gently, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you been working with any particularly greasy ingredients today? Your apron shows some staining." The woman's hand flew to the spot Miss Marple had indicated, her face flushing with what appeared to be embarrassment. "Oh, that. I was rendering some beef fat earlier. We use it in our pastry, you know. Makes the crust particularly flaky." Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "Mrs. Cobb, I need to ask where you were yesterday evening between 5:30 and 7. Yesterday evening?" Mrs. Cobb seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why, I was here, of course. We close the shop at 5:30, but there's always cleaning to do, preparation for the next day's baking. Can anyone verify that?" Slack continued. Mrs. Cobb's expression grew defensive. "My husband was here until just after 6. He can tell you." "And after your husband left?" There was a long pause before Mrs. Cobb answered, and when she did, her voice was noticeably quieter. I stepped out briefly. My sister lives just around the corner, and she'd been feeling poorly. I took her some soup." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. Here was another person whose whereabouts during the crucial period were not entirely accounted for, and someone with intimate knowledge of caraway seeds, dough preparation, and the use of fat in baking. "How long were you away from the bakery?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Not long. Perhaps 20 minutes. Half an hour at most." Mrs. Cobb's voice carried a note of pleading, as if she were asking them to believe her, despite the obvious holes in her story. As they prepared to leave the bakery, Miss Marple reflected on how the seemingly simple matter of a caraway seed had opened up new avenues of inquiry. The evidence was pointing increasingly towards someone with professional baking knowledge, and Mrs. Cobb's evasive responses suggested she might know more about yesterday's events than she was willing to admit. The seed in the dough had indeed proven to be a telling clue, one that was leading them inexorably toward the truth behind Jonah Black's carefully orchestrated death. Chapter 6. Kindling Tide Twice. The following morning brought with it one of those crisp, clear November days that seemed to wash the village clean of shadows and uncertainties. Miss Marple had spent a restless night turning over the various threads of evidence in her mind, and she arose with the firm conviction that a more thorough examination of Mrs. Rowe's hearth was essential to understanding the full scope of the crime. Inspector Slack had agreed to meet her at the cottage after his morning rounds. But Miss Marple found herself arriving early, drawn by an urgency she couldn't quite explain. Mrs. Rowe was in her small back garden, hanging washing on a line that stretched between two apple trees. Their bare branches created intricate patterns against the pale sky. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple called out as she approached through the side gate. "I hope you don't mind my calling so early." Mrs. Rowe looked up from her task, a worn bedsheet draped over her arm. In the morning light, she appeared more fragile than ever, though there was a determined set to her shoulders that spoke of someone trying to maintain normality in the face of overwhelming circumstances. "Of course not, Miss Marple. I'm grateful for any company, to be honest. The cottage feels rather oppressive just now." She gestured toward the parlor window with its lingering traces of smoke stains. "I keep thinking I should clean more thoroughly, but I'm not certain what Inspector Slack might still need to examine." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I wonder if I might take another look at your fireplace. There are a few details I'd like to confirm before the inspector arrives." Mrs. Rowe's expression grew anxious. "You don't still think that poor Mr. Black's death was deliberate, do you?" "I'm afraid the evidence suggests something rather more complex than a simple accident," Miss Marple replied gently. "But please don't distress yourself, my dear. The truth, however unpleasant, is generally less frightening than uncertainty." They entered the cottage together, and Miss Marple made her way directly to the parlor hearth. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated details that had been obscured in the previous day's dimmer conditions, and she immediately focused her attention on the bundle of kindling that remained in the grate. The sticks had been neatly arranged in the traditional manner, with smaller pieces at the bottom building up to larger ones, all designed to create the proper draft for an efficient fire. But it was not the arrangement that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the method by which the kindling had been bound together. Each bundle was secured with what appeared to be brown paper twine tied in a very specific manner. Miss Marple bent closer, her experienced eyes examining the knots with the same attention she might give to a particularly intricate piece of lacework. "Mrs. Rao," she said quietly, "who prepared this kindling for you?" "Oh, I don't prepare it myself," Mrs. Rowe replied from the doorway, apparently reluctant to enter the room where the tragedy had occurred. "Mr. Jameson from the woodyard delivers it weekly, all bundled and ready to use." "It's one less thing for me to worry about." Miss Marple continued her examination, noting that each bundle was secured not with a simple knot, but with a distinctive double knot that created a particularly neat and secure finish. More intriguing still, as she handled the sticks, she detected the same faintly greasy residue she'd noticed on the damper lever. "How curious," she murmured, lifting one of the bundles to examine it more closely in the light. The sticks themselves appeared to have been dusted with some sort of whitening agent, not wood ash, which would have been gray but something finer and more uniform. As she rubbed one of the pieces gently with a handkerchief, a light powder came away that looked remarkably like flour. At this moment, Inspector Slack's authoritative knock sounded at the front door, and Mrs. Rowe hurried to admit him. Miss Marple remained by the hearth, her mind working rapidly to process these new observations. "Morning, Miss Marple," Slack said as he entered the parlor. "Found anything interesting?" "Indeed I have, Inspector. Look closely at these kindling bundles. Notice anything particular about the way they're tied?" Slack examined the knots with the methodical attention of someone trained to observe details. "Professional work, I'd say. Very neat, very secure. Double knot, too. Not the sort of thing most people would bother with for firewood." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet Mr. Jameson from the woodyard is known to be rather careless about such things. I've seen his work before, and he typically uses simple single knots, often. Quite loose ones at that." She showed him the flour-like dusting on the sticks, and the greasy residue that seemed to permeate the entire bundle. "Someone has handled this kindling after Mr. Jameson. Prepared it," she continued. "Someone who works regularly with flour and fat. Someone who takes pride in neat, secure knotwork." Inspector Slack's expression grew thoughtful. "You're thinking of Mrs. Cobb again?" "I'm thinking of someone with very specific habits and skills," Miss Marple replied carefully. "The double knot is quite distinctive, Inspector. In my experience, people develop particular ways of tying things, and they rarely vary from their preferred method." Mrs. Rowe had been listening to this exchange from the doorway, her face growing progressively paler. "You mean someone deliberately tampered with my kindling? But why?" Miss Marple turned to her with compassion. "Because, my dear, whoever orchestrated Mr. Black's death wanted to ensure that everything in this room appeared absolutely normal. The fire had to burn properly initially, creating the heat necessary for their dough plug to set in the chimney throat. Only after the obstruction was firmly in place did they want the fire to begin backing up with smoke." She gestured toward the hearth. "This kindling was prepared specifically for that purpose, treated to burn in a particular way, bundled by someone whose knotwork would not be questioned if discovered later." Inspector Slack made notes as she spoke. "We'll need to compare these knots with samples from everyone who might have had access, starting with Mrs. Cobb." "An excellent idea," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect we'll find that Mrs. Cobb's knotwork is as distinctive as her caraway seeds." As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple reflected on how each new piece of evidence seemed to point in the same direction. The killer had been meticulous in their planning, attending to every detail that might betray their involvement, but in their very thoroughness, they had left behind a trail of clues as clear as breadcrumbs. The kindling tied twice was not simply a matter of neat workmanship. It was the signature of someone who could not resist applying their professional standards even to the tools of murder. And like the caraway seed before it, this small detail was leading them inexorably toward the truth. Mrs. Rowe accompanied them to the garden gate, her expression troubled. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "if someone really did murder Mr. Black in my parlor, does that mean they wanted me to be blamed for it?" Miss Marple paused, her hand on the gate latch. "I'm afraid that's exactly what it means, my dear. Someone counted on your being unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for your whereabouts yesterday evening. They expected you to become the obvious suspect. But why would anyone want to frame me? I've never hurt anyone." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you have a secret that makes you vulnerable. And in my experience, those who commit elaborate crimes often choose their scapegoats as carefully as they choose their methods." As she walked away from the cottage, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the peculiar cruelty of using an innocent woman's desperate circumstances as cover for murder. The killer had not only taken Jonah Black's life, but had deliberately attempted to destroy Mrs. Rowe as well. It was, she reflected, the sort of calculated malice that required a very particular type of mind, one that was both methodical and utterly without conscience. Chapter 7. The peel was out. The return visit to Cobb's Bakehouse took place during the quiet hour between the morning rush and the afternoon tea trade, when the shop typically stood empty, save for the lingering warmth of the ovens and the yeasty fragrance that seemed permanently woven into the very walls. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack approached, with the measured deliberation of hunters who had finally caught sight of their quarry. The shop bell announced their arrival with its familiar cheerful jingle, though the sound seemed somehow more ominous in the present circumstances. Bertie Cobb emerged from behind the counter with his customary smile, though Miss Marple noticed that his greeting lacked the spontaneous warmth of their previous encounter. "Back again so soon?" he said, attempting lightness. "I hope there's nothing wrong with the bread you purchased yesterday, Miss Marple." "Not at all, Bertie," she replied pleasantly. "We were hoping to speak with your mother again." "Is she in the bakehouse?" Before Bertie could respond, Mrs. Cobb herself appeared from the rear of the establishment. Her flour-dusted apron suggested she had been in the midst of afternoon preparations. Her face wore an expression of resigned weariness, as if she'd been expecting this visit, but dreading it nonetheless. "Inspector Slack, Miss Marple," she said with forced cordiality. "How can I help you today?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with official precision. "Mrs. Cobb, we'd like to examine your bakehouse equipment if you don't mind, particularly your baker's peel." The request seemed to strike Mrs. Cobb like a physical blow. Her hand flew to her throat, and for a moment she appeared unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, it was noticeably strained. "My peel? Whatever for?" "It's just a working tool, Inspector. Nothing special about it." Miss Marple stepped forward with her gentlest manner. "I'm sure it's nothing significant, my dear, but we're trying to account for all the unusual elements we've discovered in connection with poor Mr. Black's death." Mrs. Cobb's eyes darted nervously between them, clearly calculating whether compliance or resistance would serve her better. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she led them through the narrow doorway that separated the shop from the working area behind. The bakehouse was a realm of controlled chaos, with long wooden tables scarred by years of use, enormous mixing bowls, and the great brick oven that dominated one wall like a sleeping dragon. The air was thick with flour dust and the complex aromas of yeast and baking bread, creating an atmosphere that was both homely and intensely professional. "Missy?" Marple's attention was immediately drawn to the baker's peel that hung on a wooden peg near the oven. The long wooden paddle, essential for moving loaves in and out of the deep oven, showed clear signs of recent use. despite Mrs. Cobb's obvious attempts at cleaning. "May I?" Miss Marple inquired politely, reaching for the implement. Mrs. Cobb's protest came too quickly. "Oh, it's quite clean. I always keep my tools spotless. There's no need to—" But Miss Marple had already lifted the peel from its hook, and her experienced eyes immediately detected what Mrs. Cobb had been trying to conceal. The edge of the wooden paddle, despite having been scrubbed, retained a telltale dampness and a faint but unmistakable film of soot around its rim. "You mentioned yesterday that you had rinsed this," Inspector Slack observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, well, one always rinses the tools at the end of the day," Mrs. Cobb replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's basic cleanliness." Miss Marple examined the peel more closely, noting the way the soot had been ground into the wood grain in a pattern that suggested it had been used for something other than its intended purpose. The staining was heaviest, along one edge, precisely where one might expect to find it if the paddle had been used to manipulate something in a narrow, confined space, such as a chimney throat. "Mrs. Cobb," she said quietly, "this peel has been used recently for something other than bread. The sooting pattern is quite distinctive." At this, Mrs. Cobb's composure began to crumble visibly. She sank onto a flour-dusted stool, her hands trembling as they smoothed her apron in the nervous gesture Miss Marple had observed before. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. But the words carried no conviction whatsoever. Inspector Slack had been conducting his own examination of the bakehouse, and now he called their attention to a wooden bucket in the corner that bore traces of the same greasy residue they had found elsewhere. "What's this bucket used for, Mrs. Cobb?" "For various things," she replied automatically. Miss Marple approached the bucket and detected the familiar scent of tallow mixed with flour. Adhering to the bottom were several small fragments that looked remarkably similar to the dough pellet she had found at Mrs. Rowe's cottage. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we may have found where our dough plug was prepared." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a faulty chimney. Mrs. Cobb stared at them with the desperate expression of a cornered animal, her breathing shallow and rapid. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice breaking. "He was destroying everything. Everything we've worked for. Everything our family has built over 3 generations. Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. "What do you mean, Mrs. Cobb? Jonah Black?" She spat, and suddenly all her fear transformed into bitter hatred. That miserable, grasping little man. He had been bleeding us for months, threatening to report us to the authorities for using alum in our bread flour. It wasn't true. We've never used alum. But he said he had evidence. Witnesses who would swear they'd seen us at it. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. The use of alum to whiten bread was illegal, and even the suspicion of such practices could destroy a bakery's reputation overnight. He wanted money to keep quiet, Mrs. Cobb continued, the words pouring out as if a dam had burst, more and more each month. Said if we didn't pay, he'd not only report us, but spread the story throughout the village. We'd have been ruined. So you decided to stop him? Inspector Slack said grimly. Mrs. Cobb's face hardened. I decided to frighten him. That's all it was meant to be, just a scare. I thought if he found himself in a dangerous situation, if he thought someone was willing to go to extremes, he might back down from his threats. Miss Marple regarded the woman with a mixture of pity and sorrow. But you chose Mrs. Rowe's cottage for your demonstration. You knew she would be away and unable to account for herself. She said she was visiting her sister in Reading, Mrs. Cobb admitted miserably. She asked me to keep an eye on her cottage. I thought if the accident happened there while she was away, there would be questions, confusion. I never meant for her to be blamed. The confession continued to spill forth, each detail confirming Miss Marple's careful deductions. Mrs. Cobb described how she had used her professional knowledge to create a temporary seal in the chimney, how she had prepared special kindling with her characteristic double knots, how she had expected Black to be frightened into submission rather than killed outright. As Inspector Slack prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the tragic chain of events that had led to this moment. A proud woman's desperation, a blackmailer's greed, and an innocent widow's secret had combined to create the perfect conditions for murder. The baker's peel, that humble tool of an honest trade, had become an instrument of death, a reminder that the familiar objects of daily life could be transformed by malicious intent into something far more sinister. Chapter 8. Note in the Nai Aigi teapot. The revelation of Mrs. Cobb's partial confession had cast a somber mood over the investigation, but Miss Marple knew that the full truth remained elusive. While Mrs. Cobb's admission explained the method and motive behind Jonah Black's death, it did not address the deeper mystery of Mrs. Rowe's stubborn refusal to account for her whereabouts on that fateful evening as Inspector Slack concluded the formal interview with Mrs. Cobb. At the police station, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more to the widow's cottage. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the village green, and she felt an urgent need to resolve the remaining questions before darkness fell. Mrs. Rowe answered the door with an expression of profound weariness, as if the weight of the past few days had aged her considerably. Her eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of secrets too dangerous to reveal, even in the face of murder accusations. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I heard about Mrs. Cobb's arrest. I suppose I should feel relieved, but somehow I don't." "That's because the matter isn't entirely resolved, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "May I come in? I believe it's time we had a completely honest conversation." They settled once again in the parlor, though Mrs. Rowe seemed to avoid looking directly at the chair where Mr. Black had died. The room had been thoroughly aired and cleaned, but something of the tragedy still lingered in the atmosphere. "Mrs. Rowe," Miss Marple began, "Mrs. Cobb's confession has confirmed that Mr. Black was indeed murdered, and that you were chosen as a convenient scapegoat. But her plan depended entirely on your being unable to provide an alibi for yesterday evening. She knew you would be away from the cottage. The question is, how did she know?" Mrs. Rowe's hands twisted in her lap, her wedding ring catching what remained of the afternoon light. "I may have mentioned to her that I was planning to visit someone. We often chatted when I bought my bread. But you weren't visiting a friend near the vicarage, were you?" Miss Marple's voice was kind but inexorable. "Inspector Slack has confirmed that no one in that area received a visit from you yesterday evening." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the distant sound of children playing in the street. Finally, Mrs. Rowe's composure cracked entirely. "I can't tell you where I was," she whispered. "You must understand. If the truth came out, I would lose everything. The cottage, my pension, my entire means of survival." Miss Marple leaned forward with compassion. "My dear child, a man is dead, and you are very nearly blamed for his murder. Whatever secret you're protecting cannot be worth such a terrible price." Mrs. Rowe looked up with desperate eyes. "But it is, don't you see? If I tell the truth, I'll have nowhere to go, no way to live. Harold's pension is all I have in the world." It was then that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to something she had overlooked in previous visits. The teapot that Inspector Slack had noted was dry sat on a small table by the window, and something about its position struck her as peculiar. It was placed at an odd angle, as if it had been moved hastily and not properly returned to its usual spot. "Mrs. Rowe," she said suddenly, "may I examine your teapot?" The widow's face went white as chalk. "My teapot? But why?" "There's nothing." Miss Marple had already moved to the table and was lifting the china vessel. It was indeed empty of tea, but as she removed the lid, she discovered something far more significant, a crumpled piece of paper hidden within. With trembling fingers, she extracted the note and smoothed it carefully on the table. The writing was unmistakably masculine, executed in the sharp, angular hand she recognized from various parish notices and rent receipts. The message was brief but devastating. At the yard at 5:30, paper about your husband, J.B. Mrs. Rao collapsed into her chair as if the very foundations of her world had given way beneath her. "You don't understand what this means," she sobbed. "You can't possibly understand." But Miss Marple was beginning to understand all too well. The railway ticket glimpsed in Mrs. Rowe's apron, the powder under her hat, the pale band around her finger where her wedding band had been recently removed. All these details suddenly formed a coherent pattern. "Mrs. Rowe," she said gently, "you were married recently, weren't you?" Within the past few days, the widow confirmed through her sobs, and Mr. Black had somehow discovered this fact. He was threatening to expose her remarriage, which would indeed result in the loss of her war widow's pension. Through her tears, Mrs. Rowe managed to speak. "Owen Drew. He works at Millfield Farm just outside Reading. We've been keeping company for over a year. He's a good man, Miss Marple. Truly he is. But he's not well off, and we knew that if we married, I would lose Harold's pension." The story continued to emerge in broken fragments. Owen had finally proposed, unable to bear the secrecy any longer. They had traveled to Reading 3 days prior and been married quietly at the registry office, intending to keep the marriage secret until Owen's prospects improved. But somehow Jonah Black found out, Mrs. Rowe continued miserably. He had sources everywhere. That man always poking and prying. Yesterday he sent that note demanding to meet me. He said he had official documentation that would prove I was no longer entitled to my pension. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. "So you went to Reading again yesterday evening, not to visit a friend, but to meet with your new husband and decide how to handle Mr. Black's threat." Owen wanted to confront him directly, Mrs. Rowe admitted, "but I was terrified. I thought if I could speak to Mr. Black myself, perhaps I could reason with him, make him understand our situation." Her voice broke entirely. "I never thought someone would murder him while I was away." The revelation cast Mrs. Cobb's crime in an even more sinister light. Not only had she deliberately chosen an innocent woman as her scapegoat, but she had selected someone whose secret would prevent her from defending herself effectively. "Mrs. Rao," Miss Marple said firmly, "you must tell Inspector Slack the truth immediately. This note proves that Mr. Black was attempting to blackmail you as well as the Cobbs. It establishes a clear motive for someone else to want him silenced permanently." "But my pension," Mrs. Rowe whispered. "It will have to be resolved through proper channels," Miss Marple replied. "But I suspect the authorities will be more understanding when they learn you were being blackmailed by a murder victim. Besides, my dear, Mrs. Cobb's confession has already established that you were deliberately framed. The courts are unlikely to punish someone who was herself a victim of this terrible crime." As they prepared to contact Inspector Slack with this crucial new evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony of the situation. Mrs. Rowe had been trapped between honesty and survival, just as Mrs. Cobb had been trapped between her family's reputation and a blackmailer's demands. Both women had chosen deception, but only one had chosen murder. The note in the teapot had revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Not just the mechanics of the crime, but the human desperation that had made it possible. Chapter 9. Bakehouse. The Dough Plug Trick. The evening had drawn in with unusual swiftness, as November evenings do, and the assembled group in the bakehouse created an atmosphere of solemn theater. Inspector Slack had agreed to Miss Marple's request for a complete demonstration of the crime, understanding that only by witnessing the full scope of Mrs. Cobb's deception could they properly comprehend the calculated nature of her actions. Mrs. Cobb sat on a wooden stool near the great oven, her hands folded in her lap with resigned dignity. The fight had gone out of her entirely since her partial confession, and she now resembled nothing so much as a woman awaiting judgment for sins she could no longer deny. Beside her stood her husband, Mr. Albert Cobb, a solid, dependable man whose bewildered expression suggested he was still struggling to comprehend his wife's actions. Bertie Cobb leaned against the flour bins, his youthful face grave with the weight of understanding that his family's reputation lay in ruins. Dr. Haydock had joined them, his medical expertise having proved crucial in establishing the precise cause of Jonah Black's death. Mrs. Rowe remained near the doorway, as if poised to flee should the proceedings become too overwhelming. Miss Marple stood at the center of the group, her knitting bag at her side, and her expression carrying that peculiar mixture of sorrow and determination that always accompanied her final revelations. "Before we proceed," she began quietly, "I want everyone to understand that what we're about to discuss is not merely an intellectual exercise. A man died because of these actions, and Mrs. Rowe very nearly suffered a terrible injustice. The mechanics of this crime were carefully planned to exploit the vulnerabilities of innocent people." She moved to the work table where the evidence of Mrs. Cobb's preparations had been preserved: the bucket, with its tallow residues, the baker's peel with its telltale sooting, and a small portion of the dough mixture that had been found at the crime scene. "Mrs. Cobb," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe you used your professional knowledge to create what we might call a dough plug. Would you explain to us how such a thing might be constructed?" Mrs. Cobb looked up with haunted eyes, then nodded slowly. "You take ordinary bread dough," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "but you work salt into it to help it bind, and you add tallow to make it stick properly. The mixture becomes plastic, malleable. It can be shaped and will hold its form." Inspector Slack made notes as she spoke. "And the purpose was to block the chimney throat?" "Temporarily," Mrs. Cobb replied. "The heat from below would gradually firm the dough enough to create a seal, but eventually it would give way and fall." Her voice broke slightly. I thought it would create smoke and confusion, but not death. I never intended for anyone to die." Miss Marple nodded with understanding, though her expression remained grave. "The caraway seed was your signature ingredient, wasn't it? You couldn't help but include it, even in something as grim as this." "It was habit," Mrs. Cobb admitted miserably. 40 years of baking caraway bread. My hands added the seed without my mind even considering it." Dr. Haydock stepped forward with professional interest. "How long would such a plug hold under normal fire conditions?" "Perhaps 20 minutes, maybe 30, if the fire wasn't too hot initially," Mrs. Cobb replied. "Long enough for the person in the room to realize something was wrong and leave." "I never thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Miss Marple took up the explanation. "But Mr. Black didn't leave, did he? Instead, he attempted to adjust the damper, thinking the problem was mechanical. By the time he realized the true danger, the atmosphere in the room had become lethal." She moved to demonstrate with the baker's peel, showing how it could be used to position a dough plug in a chimney throat from above. The peel gave you the reach necessary to work within the confined space of the chimney. You would have needed a strap or rope to hold the plug in position while the heat set it. She gestured toward the work table. The scratch mark on Mrs. Rowe's mantelpiece shows where such a strap was drawn tight and later removed. Mr. Cobb spoke for the first time since the demonstration began, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Bessie, how could you have done such a thing? And in another woman's home, no less?" His wife's composure crumbled entirely at her husband's words. "He was destroying us, Albert. Month after month, bleeding us dry with his lies and threats. I couldn't stand by and watch him ruin everything our family had built. But Mrs. Rowe's cottage, Miss Marple pressed gently. Why there specifically? She told me she was going to Reading to visit her sister, Mrs. Cobb replied through her tears. She asked me to keep an eye on the cottage while she was away. I thought if something happened there while she was gone, there would be confusion about timing, about who might have been present. I never meant for her to be blamed. Inspector Slack looked skeptical. Yet you must have known she would return to find the body. Mrs. Cobb's face twisted with anguish. I thought she would find evidence of an accident, nothing more. I thought Black would escape with a fright and perhaps a lesson about interfering in other people's affairs. Miss Marple regarded the assembled group with profound sadness. The tragedy of this case lies not merely in Mr. Black's death, but in the fact that both Mrs. Cobb and Mrs. Rowe were victims of his systematic blackmail. He had made himself wealthy by exploiting the fears and secrets of vulnerable people throughout the village. She turned to Mrs. Rowe. My dear, you must not blame yourself for any part in this. Your only crime was trying to protect your future with your new husband, which is entirely understandable. Bertie Cobb spoke up from his position by the flour bins. What will happen to the bakery now? This has been our family's livelihood for 3 generations. The question hung in the air like the lingering scent of yeast and flour. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack, both understanding that the legal consequences would extend far beyond Mrs. Cobb's personal fate. That will depend largely on the courts and the community, Miss Marple replied honestly. Though I suspect that when people learn the full extent of Jonah Black's activities, there may be more sympathy than you might expect. As the group began to disperse, Mrs. Cobb was led away by Inspector Slack, her husband walking beside her with the steadfast loyalty of 40 years of marriage. The bakehouse fell quiet, except for the cooling sounds of the grate oven and the whisper of flour settling in the bins. Miss Marple remained for a few moments, contemplating the tragic irony that a place devoted to nourishing the community had become the planning ground for murder. The dough plug trick, as she had come to think of it, represented the corruption of honest skill into something deadly. Yet even in this darkest moment, she found herself hoping that the truth, however painful, might eventually prove more healing than the lies and fears that had made such a crime possible. Chapter 10. Kitchen Table. Who Set the Flue? The vicarage kitchen possessed that particular quality of peaceful sanctuary that seemed to invite confidences and honest reflection. Canon Clement had graciously offered the use of his substantial oak table for Miss Marple's final summation of the case, understanding that some conclusions were best reached in an atmosphere of quiet contemplation rather than official interrogation rooms. The late morning sun streamed through the mullioned windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the well-scrubbed surface where Miss Marple had arranged her evidence with the precision of a scholar preparing a crucial lecture. Inspector Slack sat opposite her, his notebook open and his expression one of grudging admiration for the thoroughness of her investigation. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's oldest friend, occupied the chair beside the window, having arrived at the vicarage with that unerring instinct for drama that had served her so well throughout their long acquaintance. Her presence provided the perfect audience for Miss Marple's methodical revelation, representing, as she did, the intelligent curiosity of the wider community. Now then, Miss Marple began, settling her knitting in her lap with characteristic precision. Before we consider who committed this crime, we must first understand exactly what was done and why it succeeded so completely in its immediate purpose. She gestured toward the various pieces of evidence arranged before them. The crumbled dough with its embedded caraway seed, photographs of the scratch mark on Mrs. Rowe's mantelpiece, samples of the distinctively knotted kindling, and the baker's peel that had proved so damning. The means employed were both ingenious and professionally executed, she continued. A disc of specially prepared dough, enhanced with salt for binding and tallow for adhesion, was positioned across the chimney throat using a baker's peel for reach and a strap for temporary support. The strap was drawn tightly across the mantelpiece edge, leaving the characteristic arc-shaped scratch we discovered. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. And this created the backdraft that killed Black. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. As the fire below generated heat, the dough plug hardened sufficiently to create an effective seal. Smoke began backing into the parlor, but the damper appeared normal, so Mr. Black had no reason to suspect deliberate sabotage. When he attempted to adjust the mechanism, he merely exposed himself to the tallow residue left by his killer's greasy fingers. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with fascination. How perfectly dreadful. But surely such an elaborate scheme required considerable preparation. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Which brings us to the clues that ultimately revealed our perpetrator's identity. She lifted one of the kindling bundles, displaying its neat double knot. First, the caraway seed embedded in the dough pellet that fell from the guttering. This ingredient pointed unmistakably to Cobb's Bakehouse, the only establishment in St. Mary Mead that uses genuine caraway seeds in their bread. Second, she continued, the distinctive binding method used on the prepared kindling. This double knot is Mrs. Bessie. Cobb's particular signature, a habit of neat workmanship, she applies to everything from paper, parcels to firewood bundles. Inspector Slack indicated the baker's peel in the evidence collection. Third, the baker's peel itself, showing clear signs of having been used in a confined environment quite different from its usual function in the bread ovens. Precisely. Miss Marple agreed. Fourth, she added, Mrs. Cobb's inability to account satisfactorily for her whereabouts during the crucial period after 6 hours yesterday evening. Her claim of visiting an aunt with soup proved impossible to verify. She paused to adjust her spectacles, regarding the assembled evidence with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally completed. Fifth, the presence of tallow and flour residues in the bucket found in the bakehouse side room, indicating that this was where the fatal dough mixture was prepared. Mrs. Bantry frowned thoughtfully. But surely other people might have had access to caraway seeds and flour. What made Mrs. Cobb the definitive suspect? An excellent question, my dear Dolly, Miss Marple replied. The answer lies not in any single piece of evidence, but in the convergence of multiple factors that could only apply to one person. Her tone grew more serious. Consider the requirements. Our killer needed intimate knowledge of dough preparation, access to professional baking equipment, familiarity with Mrs. Rowe's cottage and habits, and, most crucially, a compelling motive to eliminate Jonah Black. Inspector Slack took up the explanation. Mrs. Cobb confessed that Black had been systematically blackmailing her family, threatening to report them for allegedly using illegal alum in their bread flour. The accusation was false, but even the suspicion would have destroyed their reputation. And there lies the particular cruelty of this crime, Miss Marple observed sadly. Mrs. Cobb chose Mrs. Rowe's cottage not randomly, but because she knew the poor woman would be unable to provide an adequate alibi. Mrs. Rowe had confided her plans to visit Reading, creating the perfect opportunity to stage an accident. That would cast suspicion elsewhere. She produced the crumpled note that had been hidden in the teapot. But Mrs. Cobb could not have known that Black was also blackmailing Mrs. Rowe about her secret remarriage. This note proves that Black had arranged to meet with Mrs. Rowe, presumably to demand payment for his silence about her changed circumstances. Mrs. Bantry examined the note with horror. You mean that dreadful man was extorting money from multiple victims simultaneously? I'm afraid so, Miss Marple replied. Black had made himself quite wealthy through his systematic exploitation of village secrets and vulnerabilities. In eliminating him, Mrs. Cobb was not merely protecting her own family, but inadvertently liberating several other victims as well. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with finality. The evidence against Mrs. Cobb is overwhelming. The method matches her professional skills exactly. The physical evidence places her at the scene, and her confession provides both motive and opportunity. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting, her expression one of profound sadness. What troubles me most about this case is not the mechanics of the murder, but the human desperation that made it seem necessary. Both Mrs. Cobb and Mrs. Rowe were driven to deception by circumstances beyond their control. You feel sympathy for the murderer? Mrs. Bantry asked in surprise. I feel sympathy for the situation that created the murderer, Miss Marple replied carefully. Mrs. Cobb spent 40 years building an honest business, only to see it threatened by a man who traded in fear and shame. Her response was wrong, terribly wrong, but her desperation was entirely understandable. She rose from her chair, gathering the evidence with practiced efficiency. The tragedy extends beyond Mr. Black's death to encompass the destruction of two families who might have lived peacefully together had they not fallen victim to a blackmailer's greed. As they prepared to leave the vicarage kitchen, Mrs. Bantry posed the question that lingered in all their minds. What will become of Mrs. Rowe now? Surely her secret about the remarriage will come out during the trial. Miss Marple's expression brightened slightly. I have reason to hope that the authorities will view her situation with understanding. After all, she was herself a victim of the same blackmailer who drove Mrs. Cobb to murder. The courts may well decide that her pension circumstances deserve compassionate consideration. Inspector Slack gathered his materials with professional satisfaction. Thanks to your observations, Miss Marple, we have a complete understanding of both the crime and its context. Justice will be served even if it comes at a considerable cost to all involved. As they stepped out into the crisp November air, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar satisfaction that came from seeing truth emerge from deception, even when that truth brought pain to innocent people. The chimney flue had indeed been set deliberately, by hands skilled in the honest work of baking bread, but turned to darker purposes by desperation and fear. Flour, seeds, and the way a woman ties a knot don't lie, she murmured to herself, echoing the observation that had first set her on the path to solving this intricate puzzle. In the end, it was these small, honest details that had revealed the larger dishonesty of murder, proving once again that truth, however painful, was ultimately more merciful than the alternatives people constructed to avoid it.